In 1829, trials were held at a short section of track at Rainhill to choose a suitable engine to run on the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The competition was ultimately won by Stephenson's Rocket, hitting top speeds of 48 km an hour and winning the competition by virtue of being the only engine to travel the required distance. But while the other entrants failed to go down in history, they were not simply discarded after the trial. Several brought new innovations and would play their own part in the growth of steam power. The directors of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway initially wished for their new line to be driven by a series of stationary steam winches along the route. Line engineer George Stephenson, along with his son Robert, strongly advocated for steam locomotion, but the directors were temperamental about the idea, as steam locomotives had proved unreliable up to this point, and it was feared that they would not be up to the task of consistently making the regular run between the two cities. As the line neared completion, they agreed to hold trials to determine whether any engine would be suitable for the task. Engines would run at full speed, averaging at least 16 km an hour, pulling a coach across a 2.4 km stretch of track. They would then turn around and go back the other way. They would do this 10 times to simulate the distance between Liverpool and Manchester. They would then refuel and do 10 more runs to simulate the journey back. The winner would receive a prize of £500, more than 50,000 today. 10 trains were entered, including entrants powered by hand cranks, water pressure, and even perpetual motion. However, 5 were either disqualified or failed to turn up, leaving 5 main competitors. Cycloped was the odd one out of the group, as it was powered by 2 horses on a treadmill. A much reproduced side-on drawing only shows 1, but accounts were quite clear that there were 2 side by side. The treadmill was angled in order to keep the horses moving. Though competition stated the entrance had to be steam-powered, Cycloped was allowed to compete anyway. Thomas Shaw Bradworth, who designed Cycloped, was another engineer on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. His inclusion may have been due to favouritism, or may have been intended to create a comparison. The idea of Cycloped was not as insane as it may seem. Similar devices were used in factories to drive various pieces of equipment. Using one to propel a vehicle would have seemed like the next logical step. Cycloped came with a gearbox, which allowed the horse's power to be deployed more efficiently. In testing, Cycloped was reportedly able to travel 3 times as fast as the horses were moving. But at the trial, Cycloped struggled to pull the weight of even a single coach, barely managing 8 km an hour, half of what the competition rules required. On the second day, it was invited to run again, since it and Rocket were the only machines working at the time. This time, it never left the start line. Newspaper accounts differ as to why. According to one, the treadmill collapsed under the horses. According to another, the horses bolted before they could be loaded in. Either way, Cyclopede's run was at an end. There were other experiments in horse locomotives in the early days of railways. In the same year as Rainhill, a similar trial conducted by the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company was won by a machine called Flying Dutchman, capable of carrying 12 passengers at a time. It ran a 10-kilometre route for a few months in 1830, before it was superseded by steam engines. Ultimately, a device whose horsepower was limited by the number of actual horses which could be fit into the machine was never going to revolutionise transport. Horses used to pull trains in the more traditional way were frequently used to supplement the railways in their early days. As late as the 1960s, they were employed in shunting yards. A one-horse tramway still exists on the Isle of Man. John Reed Hill and Timothy Burstall entered a machine called Perseverance. It is the entry about which the least is known. It contained 2 cylinders and a vertical boiler. It made innovative use of roller bearings for the axles, a development which greatly reduced wear and mechanical resistance. The entry was almost disqualified before the trials, as it lacked the required mercury pressure gauge and suspension system. Hill and Burstall rapidly installed these things and it was allowed to compete. The problem was, suspension systems didn't work well with Perseverance's vertical cylinders. Much of the power of the stroke was being lost lifting the chassis up and down instead. Rocket solved this problem by placing the cylinders at an angle, so they would not be aligned with the direction of the suspension. Perseverance installed suspension springs which were as stiff as possible. This met the competition requirements, but rendered the suspension system virtually worthless. Perseverance was damaged in transit after it fell off a cart, and Birstall spent the first days of the trials repairing it. On the 6th day, it was finally able to run. It did poorly, only reaching 10 km an hour, well below the 16 required. According to one newspaper, it also suffered a collision with Pareil, which can't have helped either engine. Pareil was designed by Timothy Hackworth, the locomotive superintendent of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. It was the largest entry at the trials, which put it well over the weight limit, but it was allowed to compete anyway. Like Perseverance, it employed vertical cylinders with an almost solid suspension system. Engineers had deduced that more power could be got from a boiler by maximising the surface area of the flue running through it. Rocket achieved this by replacing the single tube with a collection of smaller ones. Pareil came equipped with a double blast pipe, which bent back on itself. Bizarrely, this meant that the driver and the fireman would have to work at opposite ends of the machine, with the tender being pushed before it. In time, the draft down the chimney would prove too much, and much of the coke was thrown out of the top unburnt. Not only did it consume twice as much fuel as Rocket, it also violated a rule that the machine had to consume its own smoke. Nonetheless, Pareil was allowed to run, and it put in a strong performance at first, but on the second day its pump broke down. Hackworth repaired it overnight and persuaded the judges to let him have another go. This time the cylinder burst, effectively ending Pareil's run. The cylinder was manufactured by a company owned by George Stephenson, a fact which led Hackworth to accuse him of sabotage, but this is unlikely. The cylinder had been supplied in a batch of 20, and Hackworth had personally chosen the best 2 to feature on his engine. At any rate, if the competition was weighted against him, the judges had already ignored several good opportunities to disqualify Pareil. Despite losing the trials, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway bought Pareil alongside Rocket. It was leased to the Bolton and Lee Railway, where it ran until 1844. It was then used as a stationary boiler at the Copper Colliery Chorley until 1863, when it was restored as a museum piece. Novelty was designed by steam fire engine manufacturers John Ericsson and John Braithwaite. They heard about the competition 7 weeks before it started and hurriedly threw their machine together. Novelty featured a vertical firebox which could only be loaded from the top, making tending the fire difficult. A long thin boiler ran the length of the engine. The flue ran in an S shape, maximising surface area but also making the pipe very difficult to clean. A mechanical blower injected air into the ashpan, aiding the fire. It was operated directly from the axle, allowing the air intake to be proportional to the train's speed. But the whole system risked blowing hot ash into the fireman's face. Though the cylinders were vertical, Novelty was equipped with a complicated system of cranks to convert the downward motion into sideways motion, thus avoiding some of the suspension problems which plagued some of the other contestants. At the trials, Novelty proved very quick to raise steam. On the first day, it performed a speed run and hit a top speed of 45 km an hour, soon becoming a crowd favourite. The Stephensons were reportedly worried that the trial could be won by an engine too light to be of practical use in an actual railway. But on the second day, the blower broke and the repairs took the rest of the day. When it next ran, a feed pipe burst and Novelty was reportedly engulfed in a cloud of steam. The pipe could not be repaired on site and Novelty was forced to withdraw. After the trials, Novelty was able to make further tests. In one, it reportedly reached speeds of 97 km an hour, but there is little evidence to support this. It was purchased by the St Helens and Runcorn Gap Railway and worked there successfully for several years. Its wheels and cylinders have survived into preservation. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Novelty, and to a lesser extent Perseverance, was to pioneer the concept of the tank engine. one in which the water and fuel is stored on the main chassis of the engine, rather than carried in a separate tender. Ultimately, Rocket was the only engine to consistently meet the requirements of the trials. Had it not succeeded, it is likely that the widespread adoption of steam locomotives would have been put back by at least a decade. But succeed it did, and went down in history for ushering in the start of the railway age. But it can be interesting to ponder an alternate timeline where Rocket had worse luck and one of the others had better, winning the trials and taking the Rocket's place in the history books. Thank you all for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to help feed the YouTube algorithm, and why not leave a comment to let me know what you think. I'm currently working on the next part of my Thames series. After that, I will be making my first train video to cover a subject outside of the UK, so stay subscribed for those. If you would like to support the channel further, I have a Ko-fi page where you can leave a thanks or commission a drawing. I also have my website on my Etsy pages, where I sell my artwork. Links in the description. See you soon!